I am an American soldier. I am a warrior and a member of a team. I serve the people of the United States and live the Army values. I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. I am disciplined, physically and mentally tough, trained and proficient in my warrior tasks and drills. I always maintain my arms, my equipment, and myself. I am an expert and I am a professional. I stand ready to deploy, engage, and destroy the enemies of the United States of America in close combat. I am a guardian of freedom and the American way of life. I am an American soldier.
The soldiers of the United States of America have a long and proud tradition of putting themselves between the American people and those who would do them harm. In its infancy, the American founders feared that the Army could be used to threaten the rights and liberties that are at the vital core of what it means to be an American. But, operating under civilian control, the U.S. Army has for more than 2 centuries proved itself to be a defender of America's freedoms. Over those centuries, the Army has fought deadly battles against foes both within our borders and on the other side of the world. The Army doesn't choose the wars in which it fights. American soldiers did not make the decision to take action in Vietnam or Afghanistan. American soldiers did not identify as enemies the Japanese and German forces of the mid-20th century, nor the Mexican and American Indian forces of the mid-19th. They did not choose to see their nation ripped apart, nor to be the cause of death for so many of their own countrymen. But they stood ready to go where sent, to defend the national interests and to advance the national cause. And the Army has done much more than simply fight. As the Center of Military History's report, American Military History, puts it, we should also consider
the Army as a social force in peace. From the beginning, the Army has played a role in developing the country, in exploring, guarding the frontier, and constructing roads, in engineering, transportation, communication, sanitation, and medicine, and in flood control. At the same time, the Army has served as a vehicle for social mobility of certain disadvantaged groups: European immigrants in the 19th century, African Americans in the 1950s and 60s, and Hispanic Americans today.
America's military history reaches back further than the nation itself. Its roots are in the European armies and the wars for dominion in the Old World. When the British colonies formed in the New World, they found that their most immediate military threat came from the native population. Though the colonists were able to form friendly relations with some Indian tribes, other tribes saw the threat that the Europeans posed and met that threat with force. The Indian warriors had no knowledge of nor interest in the European rules of war. They fought in an entirely different style than Europe's traditional massed armies. Indians used surprise attacks, striking from concealment and avoiding pitched battles. To defend the colonies, governors established local militias. Every able-bodied male was expected to serve in the militia, and every home was expected to have at least one working firearm. These men were America's original citizen soldiers. The militias drilled in tactics such as volley fire and quick response to emergency bells. They built solid defenses around each village and kept their powder dry. But in contrast to professional armies, the militias were loosely structured and generally only met a few days a year to drill. During a conflict known as King Philip's War, New England colonists and their own Native American allies battled against a confederation of other native tribes. In that war, a colonialist named Benjamin Church emerged to form a company of colonialists and allied natives. Church learned the natives' tactics for moving through the forests and swamps undetected and fighting a more guerrilla style than was known to Europeans. These were the first American Ranger force, and Benjamin Church is considered the father of American ranging. These skills proved valuable, for the conflicts did not end when one of Church's native allies killed the so-called King Philip, an Indian chieftain. From the late 1600s, almost up to the American Revolution, there were a series of wars between English colonials and French colonials, each having their own allies among the Native American tribes. The most famous is the last one, known in America simply as the French and Indian War, ending in 1763. These wars trained the men who would become the first officers to lead the Continental Army of the United States of America. George Washington commanded a brigade during the French and Indian War, troops drawn from multiple colonies. The militias, which had previously served to fight Indians in defense of British claims to the land, would soon strike the spark of revolution. At 2 a.m. on April 19th, about 700 British regulars, including light infantry and grenadiers, marched out of Boston toward Concord, where they believed rebellious colonial militia had stored an arsenal of arms, powder, and ammunition. The British were right, though the militia had already moved most of the supplies, anticipating the British move. When the British regulars entered Lexington, they had their first encounter with the Massachusetts militia. As the British advance party eyed the militiamen, someone's trigger finger itched. It was the shot heard round the world. 8 members of the militia were killed and 10 wounded, compared with a single wounded British soldier. The British troops moved on to Concord, where they found the small amount of supplies that had not been moved and burned them. As they marched back to Boston, however, the British were attacked by Minutemen who had gathered after hearing the shots fired and seeing the smoke in Concord. Shooting from behind fences and trees, the militia harassed the British regulars all the way back to Boston. The colonists were demonstrating the military tactics they had learned from the natives, a guerrilla style of hit and run, shooting from concealment at a larger but less mobile force. The militia killed 73 British soldiers and wounded 174. The war had begun. On June 14th, 1775, the Continental Congress formed the First Continental Army. The new army included the formation of 10 companies of expert riflemen to serve as light infantry. These riflemen were the first enlisted into service as truly continental soldiers, rather than a colonial militia. This Continental Army drew soldiers from all 13 colonies. A year later, the 13 states. Initially, the force was largely from New England. Most of the men were angered over the occupation of Boston, but over the course of the war, it became more balanced. The people would face their common foe together as a single national army. Later that year, on October 13th, 1775, the Continental Navy would be established, followed by the order on November 10th to raise 2 battalions of Marines. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress created the Army, but the states were responsible for recruiting and equipping the men. This inefficient process resulted in the food, clothing, and equipment shortages that contributed to 2,500 disease-related deaths at Valley Forge in the winter of 77 through 78. Enlistment periods were short, particularly during the early years, as the Congress feared creating a permanent army. Men served 1 to 3 years, and the Army never grew beyond 17,000 men. The most common guns of the American Revolution were large-caliber, smoothbore flintlock muskets. In the British Army, the firearm of choice was the British Army Land Pattern musket, which is known by its nickname, the Brown Bess. Many of the colonials in the militias and in the Continental Army would use the Brown Bess or the French pattern musket, called the Charleville. Of course, the rifle companies were using the American long rifle, sometimes called the Kentucky rifle. The rifles of the 1770s took longer to load and were more prone to fouling from the black powder. In the hands of most soldiers, the smoothbore Brown Bess was a better weapon, as it could be reloaded much more quickly and was more useful for volley fire. But the marksmen of the rifle companies took advantage of the extra range and accuracy offered by their rifled barrels and put them to deadly use. These were men such as Timothy Murphy of the Pennsylvania frontier. The son of Irish immigrants, Timothy and his brother John enlisted in Captain John Loudon's company of Northumberland Riflemen, where he demonstrated himself an expert marksman, able to hit a 7-inch target at 250 yards. Murphy's skills qualified him to be placed into Daniel Morgan's elite rifle corps. Daniel Morgan was a veteran of the French and Indian War. During the Revolutionary War, he commanded a crack troop of marksmen, backwoodsmen who had grown up hunting, trapping, and scouting. Officially named the Rangers, they were better known as Morgan's Riflemen. At the Second Battle of Saratoga, October 7th, 1777, Daniel Morgan commanded the left flank of the American forces. During the battle, the British line fell into disarray, but British General Simon Fraser was rallying them to reform. American General Benedict Arnold, who had not yet turned traitor, saw General Fraser and shouted to Morgan,
"That man on the great horse is a host unto himself and must be disposed of. Direct the attention of some of the sharpshooters amongst your riflemen to him."
Morgan did as he was commanded, and soon Tim Murphy was climbing a tree that would give him a clear line of sight to the target, 300 yards away. He fired a single shot, and General Fraser fell. Without Fraser to rally them, the British line fell apart. The Americans won at Saratoga, and in the process secured France as formal ally in the war. This first American army was also the first integrated army. Initially, Washington instructed the recruiting officers to not enlist any Negro or any person who is not American-born. But in December 1775, he wrote,
It has been represented to me that the free Negroes who have served in this army are very much dissatisfied at being discarded. As it is to be apprehended that they may seek employment in the ministerial army, I have presumed to depart from the resolution respecting them, and have given license for their being enlisted.
In New England, many slaves were given their freedom in exchange for their service in the war. The Rhode Island legislature wrote,
It is voted and resolved that every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian manslave in this state may enlist into either of the said 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of the present war with Great Britain. That every slave so enlisting shall be entitled to and receive all the bounties, wages, and encouragements allowed by the Continental Congress to any soldier enlisting in their service. It is further voted and resolved that every slave so enlisting shall, upon his passing muster, be immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress and be absolutely free, as though he had never been encumbered with any kind of servitude or slavery.
While the Continental Army was the main force fighting the British, the state militias were still in the fight. Their military effectiveness varied across the states and over the course of the war. They proved themselves deadly when fighting from cover, but were prone to panicking in the face of a bayonet charge. But the militias and the regulars served two different purposes. The Continental Army was a trained, professional force, powerful enough to draw the focus of the British Army. The British could not afford to leave the Continental Army alive and in the field. They had to send their own armies to attack Washington's forces. The Continental Army also demonstrated to the international community that the Americans had the capability to win the war and defend their fledgling nation. Without such assurances, France would never have allied itself with the American cause. But even in 1776, the United States covered a large land area, and the armies couldn't be everywhere at once. The militia filled the gap for the Americans in a way that the British couldn't match. And by controlling the ground, the state militias controlled the political situation, suppressing British loyalists and maintaining the revolutionary spirit. The Continental Army may have won the war, but the militias helped ensure that the hearts and minds of the American people remained with the revolutionary cause. Of course, the Continental Army's most famous soldier was its commander. The day after it created the Army, the Continental Congress placed George Washington at its head. Under him were 4 major or 2-star generals and 7 brigadier or 1-star generals. During the war, Washington was simply the general and commander-in-chief. Decades later, in 1798, Washington was officially made a lieutenant general, 3 stars. There was no such rank during the Revolution, and the commission in 1798, after Washington had served 2 terms as president and retired, was intended to clarify his status above and beyond other military leaders. After the Civil War, the 4-star rank, General of the Army, was created for Ulysses S. Grant. Over time, the 4-star rank would be retired and would then return again. But George Washington remained on the U.S. Army rolls as a lieutenant general, technically outranked by 3 later generals. In 1976, the Congress and President Gerald Ford posthumously promoted Washington to the rank of General of the Armies, that no officer of the United States Army should outrank him. But Washington was always scrupulous about maintaining civilian control of the military. And as the war came to an end, he and the Congress planned for the demobilization of the Army. Washington wrote,
Although a large standing army in time of peace hath ever been considered dangerous to the liberties of a country, yet a few troops, under certain circumstances, are not only safe, but indispensably necessary. Fortunately for us, our relative situation requires but few.
Congress went further than Washington expected. The fledgling nation managed with few indeed in those early years. The Navy and Marines were disbanded in April 1783. On June 2nd, 1784, Congress ordered that the entire Army be discharged, save for 80 men guarding the military stores at West Point and Fort Pitt. Though they would augment that by a few hundred men, raised out of the state militias, the force was still shockingly small to modern eyes. Why did Congress resist maintaining an army that could provide an adequate defense against the very real threat of future hostilities with British Canada in the north, Spanish Florida in the south, and the Indian tribes from all directions except the ocean? Because that's the kind of army that Americans wanted. They feared a standing army was a threat to the liberties which they had just won. And they feared paying for one almost as much. Congress established the War Department on August 7, 1789, but the regular army was still small. The American territories were vast, and the tiny force was insufficient to guard it. There were troubles with the native peoples in both the Southwest and the Northwest, though the problems were more severe to the north. The British had ceded the Northwest Territory to America as part of the Treaty of Paris. This territory included lands that would one day be the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and a portion of Minnesota, and it was already populated by various Indian tribes who had been British allies in the war. Angry over American settlers encroaching on their lands, the tribes reformed the Western Confederacy. Indian raids were answered by settler attacks, each growing more vicious, and neither side recognizing the concept of non-combatants. In 1790 and 1791, small, combined forces of regular American troops and state militias moved against the Western Confederacy and suffered brutal losses. Theodore Roosevelt later wrote about the Army's struggles with the Native American tribes. He described the conditions of the troops sent with General Arthur St. Clair against the Northwest tribes in November 1791.
The troops were of wretched stuff. There were 2 small regiments of regular infantry, the rest of the army being composed of 6 months' levies and a militia ordered out for this particular campaign. The pay was contemptible. Each private was given $3 a month, from which 90 cents was deducted. Men of good bodily powers and in the prime of life, and especially men able to do the rough work of frontier farmers, could not be hired to fight Indians in unknown forests for $2 a month. Most of the recruits were from the streets and prisons of the seaboard cities. They were hurried into a campaign against peculiarly formidable foes before they had acquired the rudiments of a soldier's training. Under such conditions, it did not need keen vision to foretell disaster.
Of the 1,400 men fighting under St. Clair, almost half were killed and hundreds more were wounded. It was a devastating defeat. Congress was moved to action. The first Militia Act authorized the President to call out the state militias whenever the United States shall be invaded or be in imminent danger of invasion from any foreign nation or Indian tribe. But at the same time, no officer, non-commissioned officer, or private of the militia shall be compelled to serve more than 3 months in any one year. The Second Militia Act stated
that each and every free, able-bodied white male citizen of the respective states, resident therein, who is or shall be of the age of 18 years and under the age of 45 years, shall respectively be enrolled in the militia by the captain or commanding officer of the company. And it shall at all times hereafter be the duty of every such captain or commanding officer of a company to enroll every such citizen. That within 1 year after the passing of this act, the militia of the respective states shall be arranged into divisions, brigades, regiments, battalions, and companies, as the legislature of each state shall direct.
The act further detailed the specific arms that each and every free, able-bodied white male citizen must acquire and maintain once enrolled. Compliance with the act was left up to the states, and as could be expected, the quality of training and equipment for the militias varied greatly. Discipline was generally poor, and the militias did not do well when asked to perform the complex maneuvers common to professional armies of the day. But they could fight well as irregulars, and they provided a large base from which volunteers could be drawn in support of the regular army. They also maintained the notion of the citizen soldier and laid the groundwork for what would one day be the U.S. National Guard. Also in 1792, on Secretary of War Henry Knox's recommendation, Congress authorized the creation of what Knox called a legion. The Legion of the United States was composed of 4 sub-legions, each with its own infantry, artillery, cavalry, and riflemen. The 1st and 2nd sub-legion were created from the remnants of the 1st and 2nd regiments of the Continental Army, and the 3rd and 4th sub-legions were new recruits. A few years later, these sub-legions became the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th regiments of the U.S. Army. Soon after its creation, the Legion of the United States, led by Major General Anthony Wayne, began retaking ground lost to the Western Confederacy. They trained hard, and in 1795, they defeated the Indian forces at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, leading to a treaty between the two nations. For the next century and more, America's armies would follow 3 main types. At the core was the standing professional army. This would remain relatively small for most of the nation's history, and its primary duties would be manning permanent forts across the country, fighting Indians, and producing engineering and other construction works. Additionally, the states maintained their militias, though these varied greatly in terms of training, discipline, and equipment. The militia elected their own officers, which did not always result in the most competent men being given command. When facing the threat of invasion or insurrection, the president could call the militia into federal service. However, they could only be compelled to serve the federal government for up to 3 months. Although the militias could and did fight well at times, more often than not, the regular army did not find them reliable under fire. The 3rd category of army troops was the volunteer army. These were troops raised only during time of war, who served 1 to 3 years in volunteer regiments. Again and again, in times of war, the volunteer regiments would augment the ranks of the regular army. And every time, when the war was over, the citizen soldiers would return to their shops and fields while the regular army manned the forts. These groups were not exactly respectful of each other. They were useless, expensive, wasteful, good for nothing, said one regular army officer during the Mexican War, speaking of the volunteers. Meanwhile, a volunteer was said to refer to soldiers in the regular army who followed orders without argument as moving musket-holding machines. But despite their animosity, when necessary, they would stand shoulder to shoulder to face a common foe. Congress took further actions to improve the quality of the Army, including the creation of a national armory. During the Revolutionary War, American soldiers had used flintlock muskets from a variety of French, British, and colonial sources. After the war, the American Army needed its own standard-issue musket. In 1776, an arsenal had been established in Springfield, Massachusetts. In 1794, it became the first national armory. In 1795, the Springfield Armory produced the first truly American musket. The 1795 U.S. Army musket was modeled on the French Charleville musket, which had been popular among American soldiers and militia. In 1799, construction began on the second National Armory at Harper's Ferry in the western part of Virginia that would eventually split off to become West Virginia. By 1810, over 10,000 muskets, rifles, and pistols were produced there each year. Another incentive for the Americans to take more deliberate steps in developing their military was the increased tension with France in the mid to late 1790s. While America had been busy creating a government of, by, and for the people, France went through a revolution of its own. And as American relations with Britain improved, its relations with the now revolutionary France soured. Britain was again engaged in hostilities with France. The French were angered by America's apparent siding with Britain and attacked American merchant vessels. In 1798, Congress created the Navy Department and the U.S. Marine Corps to add to the nation's defense. The Army was increased to over 4,000 men, and George Washington was coaxed out of retirement by President Adams to accept command as a lieutenant general. The prospect of America allying with Britain was enough to calm tensions and bring the parties to the negotiating table. War was averted, though not in time to save Adams from losing the 1800 election to Jefferson. Under Jefferson, much of the Navy was cut, and in 1802, the Army was reduced to a little over 3,200 men. As part of the 1802 reorganization, Congress created the Corps of Engineers. This was following decades-old advice from Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox. They pointed to the Army's deficit in trained engineers and recommended the creation of a military academy soon after the end of the Revolutionary War. But Congress didn't take action for several years. Like a standing army, the idea of a military academy training officers in the manner of European warfare rankled many Americans. In 1794, the rank of cadet had been created for the Artillery and Engineering Corps manning the fortifications at West Point, New York. But formal training of those cadets did not take place until 1801. By then, President Thomas Jefferson, though fiercely resistant to the idea of a strong national army, recognized the need to improve the science and engineering skills in both the military and the broader nation. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point was officially authorized on March 16, 1802, staffed by the 17-man Corps of Engineers. Jefferson soon took another, much larger action that would need the support of the Army: the Louisiana Purchase. Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark led a 26-month military expedition that required the organization, ingenuity, and endurance that could be found in the U.S. Army. These soldiers would lead their men over 7,500 miles of rough country, providing the first detailed map of the area and bringing back valuable information. It was a major accomplishment, but another great challenge lay ahead. The France-Britain pendulum swung again. Britain and France were again at war, and America was insisting that it was a neutral party. But Britain imposed trade restrictions between America and France, which was both a hardship and an insult to American sovereignty. Furthermore, Britain had captured British-born Americans off of merchant sailing vessels and impressed them into service in the Royal Navy. Add to that Britain's continued support of the Indian tribes in the Northwest Territory, providing arms to Indians who then raided American settlements, and finally, in 1812, America could take no more. On June 1st, 1812, President James Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war and received it. The regular army was increased to an authorized strength of almost 37,000 men. Volunteer regiments and state militia would also have a role in this war, and eventually 20 additional infantry regiments would be added to the regular army with one-year enlistments. infantry regiments were recruited from individual states, so that most of the men in a regiment all came from the same state. Congress offered signing bonuses of land and cash to bring in the men. In the war, America fought the British at land and sea, and they also fought the British allies, the Indians of the Northwest Territory, who were led by the Shawnee war leader, Tecumseh. Tecumseh had already been giving the American military trouble before this war began, and in August 1812, his men helped the British capture Detroit. But the city was recaptured a year later by Navy Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, and Tecumseh himself was killed at the Battle of the Thames. With his death, the alliance of Indian tribes fell apart. The greatest battle of the War of 1812 actually took place after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, ending the war. On January 8, 1815, Major General Andrew Jackson, unaware of the treaty signed weeks earlier, led an amalgamated force of about 1,000 regulars and 3,000 to 4,000 militia, including pirates and freed slaves, much to the consternation of many, to defend the city of New Orleans against a force almost 3 times his size. Years later, Teddy Roosevelt would write of Jackson's success against a superior foe.
Praise is due to the American soldiers, for it must not be forgotten that they were raw troops opposed to veterans. And indeed, nothing but Jackson's tireless care in drilling them could have brought them into shape at all. In the open field, the British regulars, owing to their greater skill in maneuvering and to their having bayonets, with which the Tennesseans were unprovided, could in all likelihood have beaten them. But in rough or broken ground, the skill of the Tennesseans, both as marksmen and woodsmen, would probably have given them the advantage. The American soldiers deserve great credit for doing so well, but greater credit still belongs to Andrew Jackson, who, for his cool head and quick eye, his stout heart and strong hand, stands out in history as the ablest general the United States produced, from the outbreak of the Revolution down to the beginning of the Great Rebellion.
It wasn't long before Andrew Jackson was leading troops to war again, this time in the Seminole Wars in Florida. The Seminoles were a Native American nation of tribes and included men who were escaped African American slaves. This wasn't Jackson's first conflict with Indian tribes of the South. Before his great victory at New Orleans, Andrew Jackson had defeated the Creek Nation in Alabama and Georgia, forcing the tribes to cede vast portions of their land to U.S. government. Indian wars continued, while America, as always, looked west. In 1846, in the wake of the annexation of Texas a year earlier, America went to war with Mexico. There was much opposition to the war, already driven by the sectional rivalry that would pull the country apart in 15 years. The nation saw support for the war in the southern states and opposition in much of the North. But the war went forward. This conflict did not involve invasion or insurrection within the U.S. borders. Therefore, President James Polk could not call the militia to federal service. The war must be fought by the Federal Army alone. At the war's beginning, the Army had about 6,000 regulars. Volunteer regiments swelled the ranks to 115,000. American forces quickly captured New Mexico and California in 1846. Then, in March 1847, General Winfield Scott led the first major amphibious landing in the history of the United States Army at Veracruz, Mexico. Among the 14,000 men following him were Robert E. Lee, George Meade, Ulysses S. Grant, James Longstreet, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, though that nickname was still more than a decade in the future. Leaving part of his force behind, Scott pushed on toward Mexico City with about 8,500 men. A few months later, Scott's men defeated the Mexican forces in the Battle of Chapultepec, capturing Mexico City. The American soldiers had won all major battles in the war with Mexico, but success in that war may have made the next one inevitable. The struggles between free and slave states, already causing deep divisions in the Union, would become even more intense. The massive lands that Mexico surrendered in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo would ratchet tensions further than ever. And the American soldiers who had just captured Mexico City together would soon face one another as enemies. Before the fighting even began, the Confederacy had already recruited one of the nation's best generals. In the years following the war with Mexico, Robert E. Lee was made superintendent of his beloved United States Military Academy. As states began seceding, his old commander, General Winfield Scott, approached him about taking command of the Union forces. But Lee could not bring himself to fight against Virginia, and he resigned his commission with the Army when his state seceded from the Union in April 1861, after the capture of Fort Sumter. President Lincoln responded to Sumter by calling 75,000 militia into service to defend the capital and demand the return of the Confederate States. But decades of inactivity by the militia meant that few of these men were adequately supplied, trained, or experienced. Unfortunately, those 75,000 90-day volunteers did not perform well in the first major battle of the war.
We called to them, tried to tell them there was no danger, called them to stop, implored them to stand. We called them cowards, denounced them in the most offensive terms, put out our heavy revolvers and threatened to shoot them, but all in vain. A cruel, crazy, mad, hopeless panic possessed them and communicated to everybody about in front and rear. The heat was awful. Although about 6, the men were exhausted. Their mouths gaped, their lips cracked and blackened from the powder of the cartridges they had bitten off in battle, their eyes staring in frenzy. No mortal ever saw such a mass of ghastly wretches.
Thus reported Ohio Congressman Albert Riddle after witnessing the rout of Union forces at the First Battle of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. The day after the rout at Bull Run, Lincoln signed a bill calling for the enlistment of 500,000 volunteers to serve 3 years. Just 3 days later, he signed a bill raising that to 1 million. General McClellan would train these new men into one of the best fighting forces in the world, the Army of the Potomac. But he would struggle to command them effectively, as would other commanders, until finally General Ulysses S. Grant took command in 1864. When the guns fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the federal government had about 500,000 shoulder arms held in arsenals in northern states. About 80% of these were 69 caliber smoothbores. The southern states possessed only about 1/3 as many long guns, many seized from federal arsenals, and again, most were smoothbore muskets. These included old Model 1816 and 1822 Springfield flintlock muskets, some of which had been converted to the percussion system, and some not, as well as Model 1842 muskets, which were manufactured as percussion guns from the start. Both sides could raise more troops than they could quickly arm, and there was a massive effort to build or buy as many guns as possible. But the Union didn't just need guns, it needed men to fire them. With the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union began to actively recruit black soldiers into its ranks. In May 1863, the War Department created the Bureau of United States Colored Troops, tasked with recruiting African Americans to fight. Almost 200,000 blacks enlisted in the U.S. Army during the Civil War. They served in the United States Colored Troops, newly created by the order of the Secretary of the Army, and included black regiments of all types: infantry, cavalry, and artillery. By war's end, the USCT represented about 10% of the Union's total forces. They fought for many reasons, but obviously, one powerful incentive was to strike a blow against the forces that had enslaved millions of their fellow African Americans. By taking up arms to join the fight, these men were not waiting to be freed. They were freeing themselves. The war dragged on, longer than any had expected. Grant's promotion to Lieutenant General in charge of all Union forces in March 1864 put in motion the campaigns that would bring the war to its bloody conclusion. This included sending General William Tecumseh Sherman, named in part for the great Shawnee war leader who had opposed America in 1812, to march his armies across Georgia and eventually to the Atlantic Ocean, laying waste to all Confederate assets along the way, including the city of Atlanta, the heart of the South. Grant himself would focus on General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, centered around Richmond, Virginia. By June, Grant and his generals were in the Richmond-Petersburg area and were digging trenches. Actions around Petersburg and Richmond continued through the fall and even into winter. A series of skirmishes and smaller battles were occasionally producing victories for the Confederacy, but were wearing away at Lee's resources. In April of 1865, the Army of Northern Virginia had been seriously weakened. After 4 years of war, rebel soldiers were worn down. Food shortages and disease had taken their toll, and more men were disappearing in the night, leaving behind a shrunken army. Then the Union forces finally broke through at Petersburg. Grant later described the attack.
We kept up a continuous artillery fire upon the enemy around the whole line, including that north of the James River, until it was light enough to move, which was about 4:45 in the morning. At that hour, Parks and Wright's Corps moved out as directed, brushed the abattis from their front as they advanced under a heavy fire of musketry and artillery, and went without flinching. They mounted the parapets and threw themselves inside of the enemy's line.
Grant had ordered continuous artillery fire along the enemy line throughout the night of April 1st. At 4 o'clock in the morning on April 2nd, the 9th and 6th Corps would attack along their respective fronts. The 6th Corps assaulted the Confederate trenches along Boydton Plank Road. The initial attack of the 9th Corps was successful, capturing 3 Confederate batteries. The Southerners were low on manpower. Their line was stretched thin. The 9th Corps had overrun the Confederate trenches. With that one break through the Confederate lines, the Southern defenses around the city were indeed untenable. After 9 long months of trench warfare that would not be seen again until World War I, the siege of Petersburg was over. The Confederate forces had withdrawn into the city's inner defenses. Grant planned another artillery bombardment to begin at 5 a.m. on April 3rd, followed by another assault an hour later. But General Robert E. Lee evacuated the city in the night. Within 2 weeks' time, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The end of the Civil War meant the return to the Indian Wars, the Dakota War of 1862, the Great Sioux War, the Black Hills War, Union General Custer's last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn, the massacre at Wounded Knee. American soldiers and settlers faced American Indians and seem, from our perspective, to have engaged in a terrible game of one-upsmanship, as each side struggled to prove itself more savage than the other. But in the end, the overwhelming power of the U.S. military was enough to defeat the warrior tribes of the American Indians. During these wars, one of the most effective generals was General Nelson A. Miles, commander of the 5th U.S. Infantry Regiment. After the destruction of Custer's force at Little Bighorn, Miles helped sweep the plains of the Lakota Indians, pushing them onto their reservations. He accepted the surrender of Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce in 1877, and the surrender of the Apache war leader Geronimo in 1898, and the surrender of Sioux Chief Kicking Bear in 1890. The Indian Wars were a difficult time, and today Americans look back at the destruction and forced removal of Indian tribes as tragic. In 1895, General Miles was named Commanding General of the United States Army. He still held that post 3 years later as America went to war with Spain. When war was declared in the spring of 1898, U.S. Army regulars consisted of just about 28,000 men. More were needed to fight a war, and the president couldn't simply call up the state militias, as the U.S. was not in imminent danger of invasion. The Army wanted an additional 50,000 men. They received 220,000 volunteers. The most famous volunteer was Theodore Roosevelt. Until recently, Roosevelt had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he was strongly supportive of this war. The Krag was a repeating bolt-action rifle chambered for the Army's new .30 caliber smokeless cartridge. It had a lower rate of fire than some of its competition, but ordnance officials believed that the slower reloading speed was a good thing, as it would preserve ammunition. This short war also saw the first use of the Gatling gun by the U.S. Army for mobile fire support for offensive combat during the famous battle for San Juan Hill. The Gatling guns used at that time had 10 rotating barrels and could fire from 300 to 900 shots per minute, using the same ammunition as the Krags. First Lieutenant John Henry Parker led the Army's newly formed Gatling Detachment. At one point, Parker's guns blazed in support of Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. By this point, Leonard Wood had received a battlefield promotion to Brigadier General, and Roosevelt was now the colonel of the regiment. Parker wrote in the History of the Gatling Detachment,
Traub pointed out the enemy, which was menacing Colonel Roosevelt's position. About 600 yards to the right, oblique from the position of the guns and perhaps 200 yards or less in front of the salient occupied by Colonel Roosevelt and the 3rd Cavalry, there was a group of about 400 of the enemy, apparently endeavoring to charge the position. Sergeant Green's gun was instantly turned upon this group at point-blank elevation. The group melted away. Captain Marcotti states that, after the surrender, some Spanish officers described this to him, stating that the enemy seen at this point was a body of about 600 escaping from El Caney, that they were struck at this point by machine gun fire so effectively that only 40 of them ever got back to Santiago. The rest were killed.
Roosevelt was so impressed with Parker's actions that day and his ability to see the potential of the machine guns that he put his own 2 Colt 7mm machine guns under Parker's command. The Spanish-American War ended with the Treaty of Paris in the fall of 1898. The treaty made Cuba an independent state and required Spain to cede Guam and Puerto Rico to America. Spain also accepted $20 million from the U.S. in payment for the Philippines. But the Filipinos had been fighting a revolution against Spain and did not consider themselves for sale. And so no sooner was the U.S. out of war with Spain than it was at war with insurgent forces in the Philippines. The Philippine-American War lasted 3 years, in the middle of which Teddy Roosevelt received a bit of a promotion. From colonel of a volunteer regiment to President of the United States. Roosevelt wrote in his autobiography,
As a legacy of the Spanish War, we were left with peculiar relations to the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, and with an immensely added interest in Central America and the Caribbean Sea. As regards to the Philippines, my belief was that we should train them for self-government as rapidly as possible, and then leave them free to decide their own fate. I did not believe in setting the time limit within which we would give them independence, because I did not believe it wise to try to forecast how soon they would be fit for self-government. And once, having made the promise, I would have felt that it was imperative to keep it. Within a few months of my assuming office, we had stamped out the last armed resistance in the Philippines. That was not of merely sporadic character.
if Roosevelt's description of events in the Philippines sounds something like nation building, then perhaps he was foreseeing the challenges that would face America and its army a century into the future. There were many changes in store for the United States Army in the years and decades to come. America's little war with Spain signaled its interest in matters beyond its borders, and its quick victory indicated that the nation was prepared to hold its own in conflicts with the European powers. It would soon have the chance to test this notion as America entered a century of world wars, nuclear threats, Cold War struggles, and Middle East politics. But as it always had and always would, the U.S. Army stood ready to place itself between America and any threat, proving time and again their motto, "This we'll defend."